Workers opened an old wall expecting dust and rotten timber. Instead, they found a room that had been a listening for them. The first crate they pried open did not hold a corpse, only a face. A whole face, peeled clean, as if the skin had tried to cling to the bone and failed, leaving grooves on the inside like fingerprints pressed from the wrong direction. But the worst part came when one worker lifted the mask. It was warm. It breathed. And in the darkness behind him, dozens of other faces began to rustle, reshaping themselves grain by grain, as though remembering what they used to be. If you think this was just a strange discovery, wait. Because the masks are changing. They removing. And one of them has taken on the features of a man who never made it out of that basement. The first blow of the sledgehammer should have shattered only brick and dust, yet when the wall of the old Manhattan morgue gave way, the workers staggered back as if struck by something colder than the March wind. Darkness unfurled from the breach in a slow, deliberate wave, not the ordinary gloom of a forgotten corridor but the thick, expectant hush of a space that had spent many decades listening. Where plans insisted a passage should run, a room without doors waited instead, its boundaries unervingly intact, as though it had been poured whole into the building's ribs during some secret hour of the late 1870s. No drafts, no footprints, no stray cobwebs softened its lines. It looked preserved not by time, but by intention. The men hesitated at the threshold. The air creeping out did not belong to any sealed chamber of a century past. It carried a sting of vinegar harsh enough to water the eyes and the unmistakable metallic breath of blood still clinging to its last heartbeat. Their lanterns quivered in their hands as though the light itself felt unwelcome. When they lifted the weakest flame toward the floor, rows of wooden crates resolved from the gloom with the quiet authority of coffins that had long forgotten the shame of death. They were arranged with meticulous symmetry, each aligned to the next by a craftsman who had either worshipped precision or feared chaos enough to forbid it. Then came the tapping. Soft, steady, impossibly controlled, it rose from inside the crates in a scattered rhythm that nonetheless seemed intentional. Not a frantic pounding of trapped creatures, nor the restless shifting of rodents, but the patient, gentle drumming of fingertips marking out a message that refused to be rushed. The sound was so delicate that the men first mistook it for the settling of beams or the settling of their own nerves, until the taps synchronized for 3 measured beats and then splintered apart again, as though answering a question none of them had dared ask. One of the workers, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped inside. The soles of his boots met a floor unexpectedly warm, as if the chamber had been inhabited only moments earlier. He knelt beside the nearest crate and pressed his palm to the lid. The tapping ceased instantly, replaced by a stillness so profound it seemed the room inhaled in preparation. His breath quickened. The wood beneath his hand, though dry and old, held a faint tremor, not from outside but from within, as if something inside had shifted closer in recognition. No reason, no science, no blueprint could explain why a sealed room without doors exhaled warmth, why crates untouched for more than a century pulsed like dormant hearts, or why the air tasted freshly of vinegar and old blood. Yet as the worker withdrew his hand, every crate resumed its quiet tapping, not louder but more certain, as though delighted to have been noticed at last. When the crates were finally forced open, the lids groaned like reluctant witnesses, and the lantern light spilled over their contents with a hesitance that seemed almost human. The horror inside did not erupt or threaten. It simply was, arranged with such meticulous reverence that the workers felt as though they had intruded upon the aftermath of a ritual rather than a crime. No bodies lay folded inside, no skeletons curled in forgotten repose, no scraps of burial cloth clinging to pauper remains. Instead, each wooden box cradled a single human face, flayed, tanned, and shaped into expressions so vivid that the men instinctively stepped back, afraid that the masks might inhale. The skin had been cured to a translucent amber, neither glossy nor dull, suspended in an uncanny balance as though treated by methods older than the city itself. Light glinted on the preserved pores with a vitality that should have diminished generations ago. The cheekbones of some masks lifted subtly, as if frozen at the moment their owners first recognized something terrible approaching. Others carried the faint downturn of resignation, a surrender captured in the final instant before terror truly struck. Not a single mask shared the same expression, yet all were united by an urgency that vibrated beneath their stillness. What disturbed the workers more deeply than the faces themselves were the hidden details along the inner side of each mask. When one crate was overturned in panic, the exposed underside revealed shallow grooves carved not by tools but by tension, impressions that suggested the skin had resisted its removal. The depressions followed the curvature of bone, trailing along brow ridges, jawlines, and lips, as though the flesh had clung to its rightful home until the very last possible moment. One mask even bore faint crescent indentations near the temples, as though fingernails had pressed into it from the outside or the inside. None of the men wished to consider which. The worker who had first touched the crates whispered a curse so soft it felt absorbed by the air rather than spoken. He reached toward one mask despite the tremor in his hand, drawn by a compulsion he could not name. Before his fingers brushed the surface, a muted tapping emerged from deeper inside the room. It was the same steady rhythm that had pulsed earlier, yet now it seemed slowed, softened, made contemplative, as if the thing producing it had paused its message to observe their reaction. The masks did not move, but something in their proximity shifted, a pressure that settled across the workers' lungs like a damp cloth. Several men bolted from the room, stumbling over crates, slamming shoulders into one another as they fled. The echo of their retreat rippled briefly, then died as the tapping resumed its patient cadence. Those who remained behind, either frozen by dread or compelled by disbelief, listened as the rhythm adjusted again. It no longer mimicked fingertips trailing across wood. Instead, the pattern contracted into shorter bursts, as if the source were measuring their breaths, their heartbeats, their hesitation. One man lifted a mask fully from its crate, expecting stiffness. Instead, the preserved face yielded slightly beneath his grip, not moist but pliant, like leather kept oiled by an unseen caretaker. He nearly dropped it when the lantern behind him flickered without cause. The vibrating air tasted sharply of vinegar again, but layered beneath that was something faintly sweet, reminiscent of old resin or fermenting fruit, an odor that did not belong in a sealed chamber untouched since the twilight of the 1870s. The worker held the mask at arm's length, the amber skin catching the trembling light. The expression stared past him rather than at him, as though recalling the last thing it had seen. Tiny shadows pooled in the preserved pores, giving the illusion that the face was subtly exhaling. His companions begged him to leave it, their voices uneven, but he could not make himself return it to the crate. He felt the weight of it not in his hands, but somewhere beneath his sternum, as though some thread between the living and the flayed had been drawn taut. Then the tapping ceased once more. The masks did not shift, the walls did not sigh, yet something in the silence deepened, as if the room itself had leaned forward. Lantern flames steadied unnaturally. The crates seemed to inhale the light rather than reflect it. In that tightening quiet, each man sensed the same thing. The tapping had never been random. It had been responsive. When the worker finally dropped the mask, its expression seemed, for the briefest instant, altered, less astonished, more aware. The crate beside it answered with a single, deliberate tap, the sound hollow and expectant. The men fled then without order or dignity, leaving their tools scattered behind them. But as they raced up the corridor, the tapping did not chase them. It persisted in the dark chamber, slow and steady, as though committing their retreat to memory. City officials moved with a haste that betrayed their fear, sealing the discovery not with documents or signatures, but with murmured directives traded behind closed doors. The old Manhattan morgue was emptied by dawn of the next day, its corridors stripped of records, its ledgers quietly amended as though the sealed room had never existed. What remained of its history was folded away like a mistake, then buried beneath layers of bureaucratic dust. The crates, however, could not be erased. They demanded containment. Under the cover of fog and indifference, they were transported to a neglected brick warehouse near the waterfront, a structure built in the early years of the 1860s and left to surrender slowly to salt air and tide-worn winds. There, in a room that smelled of mildew and abandoned ropes, an archivist was assigned to catalog what no institution wanted to acknowledge. He was a quiet man, accustomed to tracing meaning through the margins of forgotten files, but even he hesitated before the first crate. The masks lay inside as they had in the hidden chamber, face upward, amber-skinned, disturbingly alert in their stillness. The archivist approached them not with revulsion, but with the clinical fascination of one who had spent his life studying the detritus of the dead. Yet as he lifted the first mask, the faint pliancy of the preserved skin sent a ripple up his arms and across the back of his neck. He worked by lamplight, his breath forming a pale halo that wavered over the amber faces. When he turned the mask in his hands, the inner side caught the glow of the lantern, revealing a series of ridges etched along the rim. He dismissed them initially as accidental scratches, the result of crude instruments cutting too deeply during the removal of skin. But when he examined the second mask, then the third, he found the same ridges repeating with uncanny precision, as though produced by a single sustained gesture rather than careless error. Kneeling beside the crates, the archivist pressed a fingertip to one of the ridges and felt an unexpected smoothness beneath what should have been rough scoring. He lifted the lamp closer. The grooves aligned like the whorls of a fingerprint, but reversed, mirrored, the impression of something pushing outward from beneath the flesh rather than carving into it from above. When he traced the lines with greater care, he discovered that the ridges circled the entire perimeter of the mask, forming patterns far too symmetrical to be incidental. The idea took shape slowly, like ink bleeding into parchment. These grooves were not evidence of an instrument. They were evidence of resistance. The archivist imagined the moment of separation, skin held taut, clinging desperately to the bone, the underlying musculature contracting in a final reflex. The ridges suggested an internal force, a tension left behind when the flesh attempted to hold itself in place, refusing the violence that would transform it into an artifact. The thought made his throat tighten. The masks were not merely removed. They had been taken from something that fought to remain whole. He recorded the patterns meticulously, sketching each ridge and annotating the deviations. Yet the more he worked, the more the air in the warehouse thickened, as though the salt dampness were congealing around him. Once, when he lifted a particularly contorted mask, the lamplight dimmed for a breath's length, flickering as though an unseen hand passed between the flame and the air. He steadied the lantern, convinced it was only the wind seeping through the stone. But the warehouse was unusually still. Even the distant calls from the docks seemed muted, pressed back by the heavy quiet that gathered around the crates. Hours passed. The archivist's notes grew dense. His fingertips numbed slightly from the cold that radiated from the wooden boxes. When he reached for the final mask in the last crate, he found its inner ridges deeper than the others, carved into the skin in such a way that they spiraled toward the center, converging near the lips. The effect was grotesque. It looked as though the mask had tried to fold inward, as though the absent face beneath it had pulled every fiber tight in a futile attempt to remain attached. He set the mask down with unexpected care, as if afraid to disturb something dormant within its hollow. A tremor passed through his hand, but he blamed fatigue rather than dread. He leaned back on his heels, staring at the rows of faces illuminated in the lantern's wavering light. They seemed to be watching him with a patience that felt unearned. Behind him, crates he had not touched yet gave a faint sound, wood settling, perhaps, or a trick of the air shifting between warped planks. But the sound repeated, soft and deliberate, a quiet echo of the tapping reported by the workers. It lasted only a moment before the warehouse fell silent again. The archivist straightened slowly, unsure whether he had imagined it. He extinguished the lamp, sealing the room in blackness. Yet as he stepped toward the door, he could not shake the sensation that the ridges etched into the masks were not merely remnants of pain. They were messages in the only language the faces had left. Reports crept through the city with the slow, sick certainty of rot finding its way through timber. At first they appeared only in hushed conversations between gravediggers, who spoke of burial plots disturbed not by thieves, but by something far more patient. Coffins interred less than a month earlier were being unearthed to reveal nothing but hollow shells and earth that had collapsed inward, as though whatever had once rested there had dissolved into the soil. The caretakers of cemeteries in the northern wards worked by lantern after dusk, patrolling the rows with nervous pacing, swearing they heard the faint movement of something burrowing beneath the ground like an animal seeking warmth. Rumors spread faster than any official explanation. Morgue attendants, remembering the hidden room in Lower Manhattan, whispered among themselves that the space had not belonged to the city at all, but to a solitary figure who worked unseen in the hours between night and dawn. He was said to have practiced preservation techniques unfit for any medical journal, techniques that required bodies in a condition too fresh for respectable science. The old men who had been apprentices in their youth claimed that he was never recorded by name, arriving and leaving without footsteps, known only by the soft scrape of his tools against bone. He had vanished sometime in the decade following the Great Fire of the early 1870s, not dismissed, but simply absent one morning, as though swallowed by the very morgue that had housed his secrets. The archivist heard these whispers during his rare visits to the administrative offices, but he treated them as superstition until the masks themselves began to betray their static nature. At first the changes were subtle, so subtle he attributed them to the distortion of lamplight or the tricks of a tired mind. Yet each time he returned to the crates, the faces had altered, not dramatically but undeniably. The pores, once delicately preserved, appeared widened, stretching in patterns that suggested expansion rather than decay. Lips that had been full and stiff now thinned at the edges, the skin drawing inward as if shrinking from some invisible pressure. On a few masks, the faint ridge of a brow shifted its angle, correcting itself by degrees too slight for any hand to measure, yet too precise to be accidental. He attempted to document these changes with the meticulousness of his profession, sketching each mask daily, noting even the smallest deviation. But the sketches betrayed him. When he compared one day's drawing to the next, the differences appeared more pronounced than he remembered, as though his pencil had captured something the lantern light had not yet revealed. The archivist found himself returning to the warehouse at unpredictable hours, driven by a compulsion he tried to disguise as diligence. But each visit deepened his unease. The masks no longer seemed like relics forcibly removed from unwilling faces. They seemed like faces attempting, in some fragmented way, to return to themselves. The air around the crates thickened with each passing week. The salt-laden breeze from the harbor that once seeped easily through cracks in the walls now felt repelled, halted by something within the room that grew denser with time. The archivist noticed a faint scent rising from the masks, not quite vinegar and not quite blood, but something between the two, like a reaction unfolding beneath the surface of the preserved skin. When he touched one mask with the back of his knuckle, he recoiled at a sensation unmistakably warm. He tried the test again on a different mask and felt the same faint heat, subtle but rising. City newspapers began to publish cautious mentions of the missing bodies, small notes in the margins, speculating animals or grave robbers. But in the warehouse, the archivist watched the amber faces realign themselves grain by grain, as though reconstructing the memory of bone that once lay beneath them. Some masks curled slightly at the edges, drawing inward, others elongated, smoothing themselves against unseen contours. The overall shift was toward wholeness, like clay remembering the shape of its mold. One night, unable to sleep, the archivist returned with a resolve to confront the mystery directly. But when he entered the warehouse, he found several masks positioned differently within their crates, no longer lying flat, but tilted upward, as though straining toward the faint light through the high windows. He froze, lantern held halfway between himself and the faces that now seemed to watch him with something that was not curiosity but awareness. It was then he understood with chilling clarity that the masks were not relics of past violence. They were fragments in a process still unfolding, each one inching closer to reassembly. And somewhere in the city, fresh graves remained disturbingly empty, as though offering themselves to whatever sought completion. The archivist returned to the demolition site with the inevitability of someone drawn back not by courage, but by an unanswered question that had rooted itself too deeply to ignore. The workers had long since abandoned their duties there. The site lay quiet beneath scaffolding and half-toppled walls, as though the earth itself were reluctant to expose what had been entombed for so many decades. The archivist moved through the rubble with careful steps, lantern held low, searching for the place where crude planks had once been pried up to reveal the chamber without doors. But now, guided by a dread he could not articulate, he pressed farther, sensing there was another layer beneath the one they had already uncovered. He found the narrow seam almost by accident, a faint line in the floor's foundation where the boards bowed inward, as though the weight of years had not rested upon them, but had been absorbed from below. When he knelt and pressed his palms against the warped wood, it yielded slightly beneath his touch, warm in a way no timber should be in the lingering chill of early spring. He pushed harder, and the planks dipped downward before splitting along the seam with a sighing crack, revealing a hidden staircase coated in dust that seemed to pulse in the lantern's glow. The steps descended into a chamber smaller than the one above, but unmistakably older. The air grew warmer as he moved downward, thick with the sweet sour sting of vinegar and the sharp tang of iron. Each breath tasted like something fermented, ripened, waiting. The lantern illuminated wooden beams that should have been rigid, yet bent subtly as he passed, flexing as though acknowledging his presence. He forced himself not to recoil. His reason demanded he continue. His body begged him to flee. At the center of the chamber stood a workbench, slick with resin hardened in irregular drips that glistened like amber tears. Tools lay scattered across its surface, curved blades, bone-handled scalpels, small metal clamps, each coated in a residue that had darkened to a glassy crust. But what seized the archivist's attention was the mask lying at the edge of the bench. It was incomplete, its lower jaw absent, the skin only partially cured. The upper portion glistened as though freshly oiled, the pores open and supple, the texture disturbingly lifelike. When he brushed a trembling finger along the cheek, he felt dampness, a warmth more intimate than decay. He jerked his hand back, swallowing against the sudden dryness in his throat. A sound rose from the walls, soft, rhythmic tapping that vibrated through the wooden structure. It was subtler than the tapping that had come from the crates, less insistent, more measured, as though produced by something deep within the beams themselves. He turned in a slow circle, lantern trembling in his grasp, trying to locate the source. The sound traveled around him in rippling patterns, the timbre shifting as though passing through different layers of muscle rather than wood. He stepped closer to the far wall, where the boards swelled outward in a gentle curve. When he placed his ear against the surface, he heard a low, steady cadence underlying the tapping, a muffled throb that synchronized almost perfectly with his own heartbeat. Almost, but not quite. The rhythm lagged by a fractional beat, as though waiting for his pulse to slow so it could catch up. The archivist staggered backward, lungs tightening as if the air had thickened into something he was not meant to breathe. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the chamber fell so silent, he wondered if his own breath had frozen. Then it resumed, louder, more insistent, echoing through the beams with a coherence he recognized too late. It was not random. It was coordinated. It was answering him. He lifted the lantern, its light casting long shadows across the half-finished mask. The skin along its upper lip twitched, so faintly he thought it an illusion, until it happened again, a subtle contraction like the first stir of a waking muscle. A thin line of moisture beaded along the mask's edge, seeping toward the workbench. It smelled of vinegar and blood so fresh it stung the archivist's nostrils. The chamber exhaled. Warm air brushed his face with the intimacy of breath, carrying with it the unmistakable pulse of something alive, something that had waited beneath the floorboards for far longer than the sealed room above had existed. And with that breath came the realization that the tapping was not merely a signal. It was communication, a heartbeat calling to something unfinished, urging it to rise and reclaim the form it had been denied. The archivist's lantern flickered once, then steadied, illuminating the chamber with a clarity that felt like revelation. The mask on the bench curled inward at its moist edges, as if preparing to close around a skull that had not yet arrived. And in the walls, The heartbeat grew stronger. The crate seemed to pulse even before he registered the sound, the faint rhythmic tapping rising through the slats like something breathing shallowly beneath a blanket. The archivist tried to back away, but the floor, once warped timber and dust, had grown unrecognizable, a slick, living grain that shifted under each step. The building no longer pretended to be a structure. It behaved like an organism rediscovering its purpose. He had only a dim awareness of the path he had taken minutes earlier, for now the beams rose at crooked angles, leaning together in new configurations that narrowed each corridor into a throat. The air thickened with heat. Resin dripped from knots in the walls like sweat forced through pores. He pressed one palm against a post that had not stood there before, expecting wood, finding instead a surprising give, a softness like muscle beneath too thin skin. His breath caught. The tapping that had seemed scattered moments ago drew into a deliberate rhythm, not unlike footsteps circling him. Some were close, impossibly close, yet no shape pierced the dimness. Behind him the path constricted with a groaning sound, the beams swelling until their edges blurred, merging into a single bulging surface that throbbed with a quiet internal pressure. He lurched forward, desperate for open space, and his shoe caught on something soft. When he looked down, his stomach folded in on itself with revulsion. The mask lying there had not been part of the scattered artifacts he had catalogued earlier. Its edges were too moist, the color too recent, the contours unmistakably alive. He might have left it where it rested if not for the obscene warmth radiating from its surface, a warmth that suggested it had been removed only seconds before. He bent down without meaning to, his hand acting independently of his will, tugged forward by equal parts dread and compulsion. As his fingers brushed the inner lining, the mask quivered. What he initially took for pliable leather tightened in a slow ripple, contracting toward its center as though waking from dormancy. The substance clinging to it, clear, viscous, smelling faintly of vinegar, stretched in thin strands as he lifted it. And then the horror became personal. The mask flexed outward, the cheeks rounding, the jaw widening. The nose reformed, its bridge bending at the same slight angle his own had taken after an accident in his youth. The lips thinned, matching the line he often bit during difficult tasks. The pores arranged themselves with unnatural certainty, recreating the subtle asymmetry he had never noticed until now. It was his face, not a caricature or an echo, but a perfect, obscene duplication rendered in living tissue that pulsed faintly in his grip. He wanted to drop it, but could not. The thing adhered lightly to his palm, sticky yet insistent, as if recognizing the surface it longed to claim. The tapping around him surged, forming a pattern too steady to be random, a pace that pulled at something ancient and involuntary inside his ribs. The building exhaled, or seemed to, and for one suspended moment, he understood that the chamber beneath the demolished room had never been abandoned. It had been waiting, digesting its long years of hunger. The silence that followed was abrupt, total. The walls ceased their movement. The air stilled, heavy with purpose. Only one sound remained, the trembling rap of nails against wood nearby, the unmistakable rhythm of something confined and impatient. He turned slowly, the mask still burning in his hand. A new crate stood in the center of the chamber. It seemed clean, its lid fitted with unnatural precision. He had not heard it arrive. He had not seen the space clear for it. Yet there it was, as if the room had manufactured it from its own shifting anatomy. The tapping continued, steady now, familiar in a way that froze his blood. He recognized the cadence, the uneven tempo of his own anxious drumming, the pattern he made unconsciously whenever deep in thought. Only one set of nails in all of Manhattan matched it. Only one set was missing. Inside the crate, something tapped again, waiting.